The U.S. decision to shift its strategic focus to the Indo-Pacific has created a power vacuum in Europe, initiating the inexorable process of classic great power politics, which offensive realism predicts will lead, inevitably, to a profound crisis of war.
Realist Review with Professor John Mearsheimer.
Today, we're going to conduct a deep dive into the recent analyses concerning European defense autonomy. We'll be looking at Russia's reconstituted conventional threat and the political and material costs that are associated with this shifting structure of the international system.
That's right.
We are examining the consequences of a potential American withdrawal from NATO and the structural imperative that now faces the great powers involved.
And we're dissecting this problem through the lens of pure power politics. Our mission is to analyze the hard facts, sir, drawn from recent intelligence and strategic assessments.
Right.
We're looking at three critical areas. First, the chillingly specific timeline of this re-emergent Russian threat, which is projected as early as 2027. Yes. Second, these staggering quantifiable costs, what we're calling the $1 trillion gap that's required for NATO Europe to achieve any genuine conventional autonomy. And third, the current evidence of Russia's asymmetric coercion across the Nordic flank.
And this assessment clarifies the structural stakes, the real stakes, for policymakers in Washington and Brussels.
It does, sir.
Okay, let's unpack the structural shift. We begin, as we always must, with the fundamental structural condition of international politics, which is anarchy.
No world government.
No world government. There's no central authority, no global 9/11, if you will, to guarantee the security of states. This forces them to prioritize two things above all else: their survival and, consequently, the maximization of their power relative to potential adversaries.
It's a self-help system.
It is the tragic reality from which all foreign policy choices flow. For the last 3 decades, Europe has, lived under the illusion of a post-Cold War peace, sort of golden age of stability guaranteed by the American liberal hegemon. That era, by definition, is over.
And the mechanism that's ending it is this explicit reprioritization by Washington. The U.S. decision to focus on the Indo-Pacific, specifically on deterring China, which they've correctly identified as the only potential peer competitor, that decision fundamentally alters the power equation in Europe.
The structural shift is complete. This isn't just a prediction anymore. It was explicitly referenced in the political signaling coming out of Washington. It is now documented policy.
We can point to the statement made by the U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth in February of 2025. Addressing the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, the Secretary was, well, he was unequivocal.
And what did he say?
He stated that the U.S. remains committed to NATO, but, and this is the key part, its primary focus is now deterring a major conflict in the Pacific. And he used very blunt language, signaling an end to strategic patience with the European allies.
What was the phrase he used?
He said Washington would no longer tolerate an imbalanced relationship which encourages dependency and would instead prioritize empowering Europe to own responsibility for its own security.
So what does this all mean in the cold logic of offensive realism?
It's the collapse of liberal hegemony.
It means the collapse of the U.S. liberal hegemony project in Europe. For the past 30 years, the U.S. has engaged in what we call offshore balancing. It maintained a substantial forward presence, politically, materially, to keep a lid on regional security competition. Now the U.S. is moving to a different strategy. We call it buck passing.
Maybe we should clarify that distinction for the listeners.
Yes.
Yeah.
Alexander, how do we define the difference between offshore balancing and buck passing in practical terms?
Well, you can think of it this way. Offshore balancing is when the powerful friend, the U.S., steps in and proactively solves the problems in the neighborhood to maintain control.
Right.
Buck passing is when that powerful friend hands the bucket, literally the burden of defense, to the smaller neighbors and says, it's your responsibility now to deal with the regional bully. Good luck.
Exactly. The U.S. is telling its European allies to balance against Russia themselves, while America focuses its attention, its resources, and most importantly, its high-end military platforms somewhere else.
So this return to the tragic reality of self-help security that is now the dominant condition in Europe.
And if we connect this to the material implications, that transition requires Europe to replace a staggering amount of military capacity that the U.S. currently provides. The International Institute for Strategic Studies, the ISAS, has quantified this.
The scale is immense. I mean, the assumed personnel estimate alone is significant. 128,000 troops would be removed from the continent or reassigned from forces in the U.S. that were earmarked for a major NATO contingency.
But it's the loss of capability where the gap becomes critical.
Exactly, sir.
Let's avoid the jargon of unit formations. Let's focus on the practical impact. What high-end, heavy striking power is Europe actually losing here?
For any major contingency, Europe instantly loses its primary heavy armored striking power. We're talking about the equivalent of an entire fighting corps designed for a major land war.
This isn't just a number of soldiers.
No, sir. It's the core maneuver punch for any serious confrontation with Russian mechanized forces. This includes the Corps headquarters and 7 armored brigade combat teams. These are the units designed to hold the line and execute counteroffensives. Without them, the European ground forces, they really just revert to a more static, defensive posture.
And what about the other domains? The sea and the air.
In the maritime domain, the loss is acute, especially for high-end warfighting. The U.S. contribution includes 2 full aircraft carrier strike groups. It also includes 10 nuclear-powered attack submarines, which are essential for tracking Russian strategic submarines and ensuring supremacy in the North Atlantic, plus another 26 advanced cruisers and destroyers.
And many of those ships are the only platforms capable of providing naval ballistic missile defense.
That's the crucial point. It's a layer of security. Europe simply lacks the industrial capacity to replicate quickly.
And the air domain.
In the air domain, the removal of power projection and strategic intelligence is perhaps the most painful cut. We're discussing the redeployment of 24 fighter squadrons. That's somewhere between 250 to 350 aircraft.
Including high-end platforms.
High-end platforms like the F-22A Raptors and advanced F-35As. This is the air superiority component Europe absolutely relies on for deep strike and defense.
True military power, however, is not just a checklist of tanks and planes. It's the connective tissue, so to speak, that allows force projection. Alexander, what about the unquantifiable losses? The command and intelligence infrastructure.
This is where the structural dependency becomes most obvious, sir. The C2, or command and control arrangements, are fundamentally dependent on U.S. architecture. European allies would lose that significant U.S. contribution to NATO C2 systems. And the institutional shock, a major institutional shock. The position of SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander, Europe, shifts from an American general to a European officer. That isn't just a name change. It requires a massive institutional, doctrinal, and cultural overhaul of how NATO operates at the strategic level.
And what of the intelligence loss? The ability to see what the adversary is doing is often the most critical deterrent, and the most expensive capability to reproduce.
The loss of U.S. strategic intelligence assets is arguably the single most difficult gap to close. We mentioned the air platforms, the E-3G airborne warning aircraft, the RC-135 signals intelligence aircraft. They provide the eyes and ears for the alliance.
But it goes beyond that.
It goes well beyond that. The U.S. commitment includes high-end military space capabilities, cyber assets. If the U.S. draws down its intelligence provision, Europe's shortfalls in strategic space and all-domain ISR, or intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, would be critically exposed.
And the consequence.
It dramatically reduces Europe's ability to detect early indicators of a Russian attack. It cripples their ability to understand Russian intentions once a conflict begins. The loss is not just hardware. It's the entire institutional architecture for warfighting that the U.S. guarantees.
So the structural shift creates the conditions for classic security competition. If the U.S. is withdrawing, the resulting power vacuum demands that Russia act rationally.
From their perspective?
From their perspective, Russia views NATO expansion as an existential threat. This is stated explicitly in their policy documents. Therefore, Russia is now compelled by the structural condition of anarchy to maximize its power to ensure its survival. The goal is not morality. The goal is preparation for the inevitable security dilemma competition that the U.S. withdrawal facilitates.
And the data confirms this choice. Russia's economy is already on a war footing. The defense expenditure data is definitive. It reached 6.7% of GDP in 2024. That's more than double the average before the 2022 invasion.
What does that number 6.7% of GDP, projected to reach 7.5%, tell us about Moscow's long-term intentions?
That level of spending indicates a commitment to total war production, something akin to the Soviet era. And it's independent of the immediate outcomes in Ukraine. It shows a long-term strategic shift. When a state allocates nearly 7.5% of its entire national wealth to defense, it signifies a non-negotiable strategic objective.
Which is?
Reconstitution in preparation for future, potentially larger security competition. Moscow is signaling that it has not abandoned its objectives in its near abroad and is preparing for a multi-year contest with NATO.
This leads directly to the question of the reconstitution timeline. which shows a dangerous variance among Western intelligence agencies.
Exactly. Some assessments offered a more comfortable, maybe a decade-long timeline for Russia to fully recover. We saw this from the UK Chief of Defense Staff, the Estonian Intelligence Service.
A politically soothing timeline.
Perhaps, but the more pessimistic, and I would argue more actionable, timelines are much shorter. Norway's Chief of Defense suggested a window of vulnerability of only 2 to 3 years.
2 to 3 years is virtually no time at all for military planners, especially given the scale of the trillion-dollar deficit we've just discussed.
And that's why the emerging consensus is so concerning. The IS assessment aligns with intelligence from the Danish Defense Intelligence. They assessed in early 2025 that Russia could pose a significant military challenge, particularly to the Baltics, within 2 years of any sustained ceasefire.
So the consensus timeline.
The I-synthesis projects that Russia could pose a credible conventional threat to the region as early as 2027.
How can Russia possibly recover so quickly? We know they've sustained massive losses in Ukraine, thousands of platforms.
They're prioritizing quantity over quality. It's a rational strategic choice, given their limitations and the scale of their losses. By 2027, the analysis suggests Russia could mirror its February 2022 active equipment holdings by focusing relentlessly on two things: refurbishing mountains of stored Soviet-era equipment and ramping up production of modernized systems like the T-90M tank.
Let's put some numbers on that. What will Russia be able to field by 2027?
By 2027, they're projected to field around 3,300 main battle tanks, 11,000 APCs and IFVs. And critically, they aim for 2,000 self-propelled artillery pieces.
But this equipment will be of, differing ages and sophistication.
That's right. Not all units will be at high readiness, but they will have recuperated and re-equipped enough to pose a credible conventional threat, particularly to the smaller members of the alliance.
So the strategy is clear. Rebuild the ground forces and focus on mass. Where are they expanding these forces?
They're implementing plans for massive force expansion, especially targeting the Nordic flank by reestablishing the Leningrad military district. This was confirmed in 2024.
And the scale of that expansion.
Current plans are to increase the ground force from the 2 divisions and 6 brigades they had in 2022 to potentially 9 divisions and 1 brigade. That's a dramatic increase in force projection capability right on the border with Finland, the Baltics, and Norway.
How do they accelerate this?
By opting for tiered readiness levels. This means only a few high-readiness units get the modern equipment. The vast majority operate older, refurbished platforms and are probably understaffed. They're sacrificing sophistication for the rapid fielding of large formations. This strategy ensures they can create a numerical threat quickly.
And what is their single largest material shortfall in this plan?
The biggest equipment shortfall they face is over 1,000 self-propelled artillery pieces. These are central to Russian doctrine. The sheer volume of fires doctrine requires those platforms.
So they must fill this gap.
They must. And they'll likely do so using older towed artillery, supplementing those with cheap one-way attack drones for reconnaissance, and crucially, relying on external imports from partners like North Korea to plug the holes in their deep strike capability.
It is essential to contrast the substantial losses in the ground forces with the relatively intact nature of Russia's air and maritime power.
That's a key point, sir. The aerospace forces, the VKS, have suffered losses, but they're concentrated in ground attack platforms. Aircraft manufacturing is continuing. They intend to increase production of the Su-35 fighter and Su-34 bomber, and they're modernizing their Tu-160 strategic bomber fleet.
So the VKS remains a considerable challenge.
Yes, especially given Europe's limited integrated air defense systems outside of the U.S. architecture, and the Navy, similarly, remains largely intact outside the Black Sea.
And their long-term naval focus is on long-range precision conventional strike.
It is. Future capability is centered on commissioning new Yasenem-class nuclear submarines and Gorshkov-class frigates. These aren't old Soviet platforms. These are new, highly capable assets designed to field advanced weapons like the Zircon high-speed missile. This validates their focus on strategic, long-range precision strike, giving them a reach that bypasses much of Europe's conventional defense.
So, the conventional threat is the looming military confrontation of 2027. But the immediate friction is occurring daily in the gray zone. We must define hybrid threats clearly. They are not a new form of warfare. They are, non-military practices for covert manipulation.
Political subversion, economic disruption.
Exactly. They are designed specifically to disrupt daily life and erode public trust in governments and institutions. The critical feature is that these actions are designed to remain just below the threshold of a conventional Article 5 invocation.
The aggressor imposes costs, while avoiding a clear military response. It challenges the very definition of an attack.
What's fascinating here is that Russia uses these low-level actions like drone incursions to achieve multiple strategic goals at once. They test allied air defenses, they impose psychological and economic costs, and they exploit the security dilemma among NATO members.
The uncertainty over Moscow's intent forces NATO to commit expensive countermeasures, which Moscow then uses rhetorically to justify its own reciprocal buildup. It's a calculated feedback loop, sir. It just fuels the spiral.
And we have concrete, recent evidence of this testing on the Nordic flank in late 2025.
We do. The end of September 2025 was a high watermark for this kind of coercion. Multiple airports across the Nordic region were forced to shut down after a series of unexplained drone sightings near sensitive infrastructure.
Give us the specifics, Alexander. How immediate was the impact?
The impact was immediate and costly. Copenhagen Airport, Kastrup, halted all flights for 4 hours on September 22nd. This followed reports of 2 or 3 drones operating in its restricted airspace. Less than 24 hours later, Oslo Airport temporarily shut down after a similar incident.
And this was happening alongside conventional provocations.
Concurrent with these, yes. Danish intelligence reported highly risky conventional provocations. Russian warships sailing on dangerous collision courses with Danish naval vessels, and most aggressively, aiming weapon systems at Danish Air Force helicopters during routine patrols.
And the intelligence assessment.
The assessment concluded this was hybrid warfare, designed explicitly to impose costs and test Allied readiness thresholds.
This friction immediately exposed political fissures. How did the two key Nordic allies, Denmark and Norway, diverge in their strategic response?
Well, this divergence is a perfect illustration of how hybrid coercion works. Denmark adopted a strategy of deterrence through attribution. Officials quickly labeled the incidents as hybrid activity, pointed strongly at Russia, and the Prime Minister called on NATO to intensify its response.
For Denmark, it was about allied cohesion.
Precisely, turning uncertainty into a rallying point. But Norway chose restraint.
Why?
Their position is highly informed by their geography. They share a direct land border with Russia. As of early October 2025, their security services had not officially attributed any of the incidents to a state actor. The Norwegian Minister of Defense stated publicly, Norway is not under attack.
So they want to avoid escalation.
They want to avoid perceived escalation on the border. But this cautious approach intensifies their communication dilemma when Copenhagen calls for a strengthened, explicitly anti-Russian allied response. It fundamentally opposes Oslo's traditional approach.
And this political friction is precisely the goal of hybrid coercion, to exploit divisions, increase uncertainty, and make the Article 5 commitment appear soft. So how have NATO and the EU attempted to counter this?
The Allied reaction has coalesced into 2 main initiatives. NATO launched Operation Eastern Sentry to strengthen air defense on the eastern flank, focusing on intercepting drones. At the same time, the EU proposed a much larger framework, the European Drone Defense Initiative, or the Drone Wall, and the broader Eastern Flank Watch.
The goal being to integrate air defense and surveillance along the EU's eastern borders.
Yes, sir.
If we connect this back to the material reality, these defensive responses are operationally possible, but we must ask if they are strategically sound or fiscally sustainable. What is the fundamental fiscal tragedy of this drone wall?
The tragedy is the cost-exchange ratio. You're deploying sophisticated fighter jets and expensive air-to-air missiles against cheap Russian drones. You're using high-end SAM batteries against commercially modified UAVs. It's a highly unfavorable economic exchange.
From a realist perspective, we call this operationally possible but fiscally unsustainable.
Exactly. Russia can bleed Europe's defense budget dry just by scaling up its drone attacks, forcing the West to spend millions to counter platforms that cost a few $1,000s.
And this leads, inevitably, to internal political tensions.
Absolutely. The drone wall initiative is facing significant pushback. Frontline states like Poland and the Baltics see it as an urgent necessity. But countries further from the border, like France and Germany, are questioning its massive cost, its technical feasibility, and the risk of Brussels encroaching on national defense prerogatives.
We see an element of buck passing to Brussels.
We do. The political burden is transferred to the EU headquarters, but the fiscal commitment remains highly contested by the major powers.
The structural demand, the U.S. pivot, dictates that Europe must execute a strategy of self-help. This means acquiring the necessary capabilities for survival. And the IS assessment gives us the cold, hard price tag.
The one-off procurement cost to replace U.S. conventional capacity is estimated to range between $226 billion on the low end and $344 billion on the high end. And that's just for new weapon systems.
But that is only the beginning of the cost. The truly staggering figure is the long-term commitment. In defense economics, the accepted rule of thumb is that life cycle costs, maintenance, personnel training, are at least double the initial procurement cost.
Which means the total price over a 25-year life cycle to replace the U.S. capacity is approximately $1 trillion.
That is the quantifiable price of European autonomy. And this cost comes on top of existing defense plans and targets. This colossal deficit represents a monumental failure in long-term strategic planning by European powers.
They preferred the convenience of the American security guarantor, sir.
Let's delve into the scale of the required procurement. Where exactly does that $344 billion high-end estimate go?
The cost is fairly evenly split across the three domains. Land is about 27%, maritime is 36%, and air is 36%. But identifying the top three most expensive shortfalls really illuminates the key capability gaps.
What is the first one?
First, the most expensive single-line item is in aerospace, acquiring 400 additional tactical combat aircraft, fighters and ground attack aircraft. The cost for these ranges from $48 billion to $64 billion. This is the difference between achieving air superiority and fighting blind under Russian air defenses.
And the maritime gap.
Second, in the maritime domain, the requirement for 20 advanced destroyers alone absorbs between $40 billion and $50 billion. These ships are critical for high-end surface warfare, anti-submarine warfare, and providing missile defense. Without them, the North Atlantic supply lines are dangerously exposed.
And the third?
Third, the land domain, a massive investment in long-range surface-to-air missile batteries, like Patriot or SAM-PT. Acquiring 24 LR SAM batteries is estimated to cost between $12 billion and $24 billion. And on top of that, hundreds of additional main battle tanks and fighting vehicles, adding tens of billions more.
Here is where it gets truly interesting. The sheer material shortfalls expose the security dilemma trade-offs identified by the ISS. European countries face a brutal choice.
The trade-off is speed versus domestic industrial support. They can support their own defense industry, funneling the money to national champions. But this leads to long lead times, meaning the dangerous window of vulnerability stays open for longer, maybe past 2030. Or they can purchase off-the-shelf from abroad, from Korea for rocket artillery, or the U.S. for low-observable fighters, to speed up deployment. But that just creates new dependencies on non-European suppliers. This dilemma slows Europe's pivot to self-help.
And the industrial limitations are a severe constraint. Can Europe's current industrial base even handle this demand?
Not without radical reform and investment, and that takes political courage. European military shipbuilding capacity has been reduced. The UK has closed key facilities. Delivering 20 new destroyers and 3 or 4 nuclear submarines in a compressed timeline required a level of state commitment not seen since the Cold War.
The same applies to the land domain.
Yes, sir. European producers have limited manufacturing capabilities. The path of least resistance and fastest results is foreign procurement. But that political choice is fiercely resisted by France and Germany, who prioritize their domestic industry.
Ultimately, this trillion-dollar deficit is a political constraint, not an economic one. Europe has the wealth.
Precisely. While European defense spending growth hit a record 11.8% in 2024, achieving genuine Cold War levels, which were routinely over 3% of GDP, requires a radical long-term political will we just haven't seen yet. 2% is the floor, not the ceiling.
And reliable funding is the critical bottleneck preventing industrial expansion.
It is. Achieving that trillion-dollar figure requires sustainable long-term funding instruments. We see initiatives like the EU's Rearm Europe program, but it's paralyzed by internal division. Key members, France, Italy, Spain, are resisting debt-based plans.
So this lack of reliable long-term government contracts is the major factor slowing everything down.
It is, sir. It discourages the necessary private finance. Europe simply lacks the political unity or the collective institutional courage to fully resource its own survival. This ensures that the window of vulnerability remains wide open.
We now move to the most dangerous element of this confrontation, the role of nuclear weapons. For Russia, nuclear capability is central. It compensates for the inherent conventional disparity between Russia and the United West. Russia is forced to leverage its nuclear posture to ensure its survival.
And to project power.
And to project power in the face of what it perceives as an existential threat from NATO. This structural reality is reflected in their doctrine. The 2020 and 2024 updates to Russia's nuclear doctrine reflect an increasingly assertive posture.
We have to look at the intellectual architects behind this, strategists like Sergei Kurganov. He advocates for what he calls proactive deterrence. Their argument is designed to reintroduce existential fear into Western strategic calculations.
They're attempting to redefine the nuclear taboo.
They are, sir. They're framing the avoidance of nuclear use as strategically immoral if it leads to the loss of Russia's perceived vital interests.
The chilling goal is psychological, to ensure Washington understands that the nuclear bullet is in the revolver, and that Russia is willing to reach for it first to de-escalate a conventional war on its own terms.
And the ultimate structural goal, from Moscow's perspective, isn't just to deter an attack on Russia, it's to undermine the NATO Article 5 commitment itself. Many Russian strategists genuinely believe that Article 5 would not hold under sustained nuclear pressure.
Thereby rendering the American security guarantee a myth in a major crisis.
Right, exactly.
The proponents of this hawkish doctrine have explicitly detailed the escalation ladder they believe the West must be made to fear. Alexander, walk us through the sequence.
The sequence involves calculated, progressive steps. First, conventional strikes on a NATO country. If that fails to deter, the next step is a demonstrative nuclear strike away from NATO territory, maybe over the Black Sea or the Arctic. Something to break the taboo without massive casualties.
And if that fails?
The next steps involve escalating strikes on overseas military bases that are supporting the war, perhaps in Poland or Romania. The secondary objective is always to achieve political goals, undermining Article 5 and forcing NATO infrastructure to roll back to pre-1997 levels.
This brings us to the fatal flaw of Western policy, which is rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of conflict dynamics. Contrast the Cold War strategy of escalation control with the post-Cold War policy of escalation management.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the U.S. strategy was escalation control, dictating the pace, raising the stakes to force the enemy to back down. This was a strategy of strategic dominance.
Today, the policy is escalation management. And this is defined by a deep, almost pathological fear in the West of provoking Russia. The constant strategic constraint is, won't this increase the threat of nuclear war?
From a realist perspective, this policy is entirely self-defeating. It is structurally flawed. Western de-escalation holding back aid, imposing geographic constraints, it signals weakness. It grants the aggressor the initiative.
And when an aggressor is allowed to act with impunity, it leads to greater escalation.
Precisely. We see this through the increased involvement of China, Iran, North Korea in Russia's military efforts. They are confident the West will not risk confronting them directly.
And crucially, Russia has learned the fundamental lesson. Bluffing nuclear blackmail is an effective, no-cost weapon. It requires no resources, but it works reliably to slow Western aid and constrain strategic decision-making. This single factor guarantees the protraction of the conflict.
This self-imposed constraint has had profound practical consequences, especially for Ukraine. The West's insistence that Ukraine fight a purely defensive war confined to its own territory. It has enormous structural disadvantages.
It makes the conflict inherently protracted and devastating, sir.
Explain the economic implication of this purely defensive posture.
Well, defense, in this context, is simply more expensive than offense. The West is forced to invest billions into providing sophisticated air defense systems for Ukraine Patriots NASAMS to defend civilian targets. Meanwhile, Russia can use cheaper drones and missiles to attack at will, operating with relative impunity from safe zones inside its own territory.
And the failure to allow long-range retaliatory strikes on Russian territory means the aggressor does not bear the cost of the war domestically.
That's right. It's an external war for them, which minimizes political backlash. This exacerbates the conflict's protracted nature, leading to social exhaustion in Ukraine and political fatigue in partner countries. The strategy of defensive war, driven by this fear of escalation, has ensured the conflict continues indefinitely.
So let us synthesize the argument. The structural condition of anarchy, coupled with the U.S. withdrawal, creates a highly unstable, multipolar regional environment in Europe where there is no effective security guarantor. Russia is acting rationally to maximize its security against a perceived existential threat. Europe, meanwhile, is failing to meet the requirements of self-help. It's trapped between a fiscal imperative it cannot meet, the trillion-dollar gap, and profound political divisions that prevent true collective defense. The tragedy is already unfolding. We must therefore conclude with the inevitable predictions which flowed directly from the structural forces at play. There is no hope here. There is only logic. First, on Washington. The U.S. commitment will remain fixed on Asia. Washington will continue its policy of buck passing, offering rhetorical support and limited material aid to stabilize the European periphery. but it will not recommit the necessary conventional force structure to Europe. The U.S. will not fundamentally re-engage unless a major power conflict in the Pacific stabilizes or concludes, which is unlikely. Europe is now structurally alone. Second, on NATO. The alliance will proceed with its flawed, expensive defensive projects, the European drone wall, Operation Eastern Sentry. These initiatives will consume substantial resources but will remain structurally vulnerable due to insufficient long-term funding and fractured political will. This ensures the window of vulnerability remains open, not closing in 2027, but well beyond that. The alliance will be defined by rhetorical commitments that mask its material impotence. And third, on Moscow. Seeing NATO's conventional shortfall and the West's fear of nuclear escalation, Russia will continue to maximize its power. It will test the limits of Western cohesion through sustained conventional buildup and increasing hybrid attacks, especially in the Nordic and Baltic areas. This increases the likelihood of a localized incursion designed explicitly to test the credibility of Article 5. This incursion, by design, risks invoking collective defense under the most ambiguous and dangerous nuclear-backed circumstances. The path of great power competition in Europe is now set. I want you to consider the history of the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides observed that the war became inevitable because of the growth of Athenian power and the fear that growth instilled in Sparta. In this modern European context, what rising power is primarily driven by fear, and which states are failing to respond with the commensurate power required to manage that fear? The answer to that question will define the trajectory of the next decade.